Welcome, everyone. I'm Kirsty Cullen, CEO at the Optimum Health Clinic, and I welcome you today to our Cuppa and Chat series, where we'll be taking just a few moments to chat to some of our industry friends. I'm hoping that this will be an informative snapshot around some of the tools that are helpful for those suffering with fatigue or for those who are working with the fatigue community. As we get this series underway, we will post online a little advance notice of who we'll be chatting with, so you can post your questions and we will be very happy to answer and ask those on your behalf. So to kickstart the series, I'm delighted to welcome Anastasia Smith from Genova Diagnostics. Anastasia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Genova are, for those that don't know, a functional testing laboratory. And so over the next few posts, Anastasia and I will just mull over some of the functional tests that we might consider when we're looking at cases of prolonged fatigue. So Anastasia, can we just kick off by really asking the question, I suppose, that lots of people want to know. What is functional testing and why is it different to conventional medical testing?
Yeah, it's a great question because I'm sure a lot of people want to understand why they should invest in functional testing, because of course it's a private, thing that people are going to be investing in addition to potentially tests that they might be doing through their GP or doctor. So functional testing is essentially it really falls under the umbrella of preventative medicine, integrative medicine. It really sort of it resonates with the perspective of looking at the body as an interconnected sort of network of systems. And what functional testing really is aiming to do is to identify the underlying drivers of disease symptoms, a collection of symptoms which fall under the umbrella of a specific condition. So we're looking at very sort of subtle, sometimes quite cutting edge biomarkers that may give us an insight into the functioning of various systems, such as your digestive system, or how well you're dealing with stress, or how you are potentially functioning in terms of your hormone balance, sex hormone balance. And so that really sort of is, in a nutshell, functional testing.
Great stuff. So let's dig straight into adrenal testing or adrenal stress testing. Why is that so interesting from a fatigue perspective, and what can we learn from it?
So the adrenal stress panel, what it measures is cortisol, and cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone. And so in relation to chronic fatigue, it can be a very important biomarker to test for, because it gives us an insight into how the person is dealing with stress in their environment, and how potentially over time they may be sort of struggling with that response. Of course, we want to have good levels of cortisol because it reflects our ability to deal with our everyday challenges, the anticipation around our everyday challenges. And it's also really important for our immune system and our energy levels as well, but we don't want too much or too little of it. And so the adrenal stress profile, really what it gives us an insight into is how, our nervous system and how we may be adapting to our environment and the potential stresses that are in our environment. The adrenal stress profile measures free cortisol, which represents a small percentage of overall cortisol production in the body. However, it is what we call the unbound, biologically available and active portion of cortisol. So it's the part of cortisol, or the type of cortisol, should I say, that is free and available to exert its function on our tissues and cells. So it's really the important sort of cortisol that we want to be looking at in relation to how we're sort of dealing with those everyday challenges. It also gives us an insight into things like our blood sugar levels, how balanced our blood sugar levels are, which is really important in relation to fatigue, because of course that's how we mediate our energy. It gives us an insight into things like pain and how we're dealing with that pain, our sort of our ability to sort of deal head on with those sorts of things on a day-to-day basis. It also measures DHEA, which is a hormone which we would describe as an anabolic hormone, as opposed to cortisol, which is a catabolic hormone. So cortisol has a very catabolic impact on the body. So over time, if it's sort of overabundant, then it can have this sort of wear and tear effect on the body. Whereas DHEA has an anabolic impact, that it helps with repair, rejuvenation, etc., and it really helps to counterbalance the negative impact of hypercortisol, production. So it's a really great way of sort of measuring someone's balance between those two sort of systems. I should probably also include that the adrenal stress profile gives us an insight into our circadian rhythm. So for that reason, we do 4 measurements throughout the day through saliva, by the way. I didn't mention that at the beginning, but it's a saliva test. So you can do that in the comfort of your own home. And there are 4 key readings throughout the day to measure how well your circadian rhythm is responding. And your circadian rhythm is really important in relation to your sleep and wake cycle. So we're looking at a specific pattern throughout the day. We want to see cortisol nice and robust in the morning, and we want to see it tapering off throughout the day. And often you're seeing imbalances where you might get a peak at the wrong time of the day. You may get too low levels of cortisol at the wrong time of the day. So it's a really interesting insight into the body's sort of overall functioning and the nervous system particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. And fatigue on waking is such a common symptom that we see in our particular client base. Can you talk a little bit about the cortisol awakening response and why that's useful and how it's measured in this particular test?
Yeah, absolutely. So the cortisol awakening response is an add-on to the test. So it's not automatically included. It's essentially an extra 2 cortisol samples. But what the time of those samples is very essential. So what we're looking at is how able is someone to mount a cortisol peak within the first half an hour of waking. That really does give us an insight into the person's ability to, or their anticipation around the challenges throughout the day, and the stresses that they might, encounter throughout the day. So for example, if someone wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning, they want to have that cortisol saliva sample taken immediately after getting up, or after waking, should I say, not even, you don't even need to leave your bed. You have it there ready to take in the morning. And then half an hour later. And what we want to see is this transient increase in cortisol. We want to see really a doubling of that cortisol level within that first half an hour. And again, as I mentioned, it really helps to reflect our the person's sort of ability to anticipate and their resistance or resilience, should I say, to sort of anticipate those challenges throughout the day. And it also gives us an insight into, again, their circadian rhythm. So if they're not mounting that peak in the morning, within the first half an hour of waking, they may not be also able to produce enough melatonin in the evening, which is really important for sleep, as we all know. So yeah, it can give you various insights. It's an interesting add-on to that test.
Yeah, superb. I know the other thing that we tend to see a lot clinically is the classic night owl. So where that circadian rhythm's been disrupted, where we've got somebody who is awake through the night and will sleep often through the day. Does that provide difficulties in terms of testing with the adrenal stress test?
Yeah, unfortunately, the test is the reference ranges for each of those readings don't reflect someone who, for example, may be a shift worker and works throughout the night and therefore sleeps during the day. It doesn't reflect someone who potentially isn't sleeping at all, is having quite severe insomnia. Because of the fact, and I'm talking specifically more so around the cortisol awakening response, because for example, if someone's waking at, I don't know, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and they're sort of not really managing to get back to sleep, and they decide to then do their cortisol awakening response when they get up at 7, for example, it's not really going to reflect an accurate representation of their ability to mount that cortisol response, because they potentially might have already done that at the time that they woke up at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. So it really is a tricky thing when it comes to someone's sleeping patterns, and potentially if they aren't sleeping properly throughout the night, how is that going to impact that initial sample? If they're just doing the regular cortisol throughout the day, then absolutely yes, it can still give you a really interesting insight into your production of cortisol, into your HPA axis, which is the acronym for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which sort of illustrates this sort of beautiful orchestra hormonal network between those glands, and is a reflection of our nervous system. But yes, so if you're a shift worker, or if you're not sleeping at all, the cortisol awakening response potentially is not the right add-on for you.
Okay. I know one of our listeners has posed a question already in readiness for our chat today. And I think he really wanted to know if existing blood work from his doctor might indicate the need for further functional adrenal testing, or whether actually we're looking more at clinical signs and symptoms when we're thinking towards an adrenal stress test.
So it's a difficult question to answer, because typically in a GP practice, they wouldn't test for cortisol. You may go to an endocrinologist and they will test cortisol there, but it would normally be a blood sample. So it wouldn't reflect, it would potentially reflect more of the bound version of cortisol rather than the free cortisol, which as you will recall, it's the portion of, or the type of cortisol that is free and available to exert its function on tissues and cells. So it may not give you such an accurate insight into the cortisol that's there and available to actually have this biologically active impact. In terms of other tests, in terms of in relation to adrenal stress, potentially a thyroid test could give you an insight into HPA axis dysfunction as well, and potentially adrenal dysfunction. But I think really we're sort of looking more at the signs and symptoms of HPA axis dysfunction, a dysregulation in our nervous system, stress, issues such as fatigue throughout the day, or a lot of anxiety, for example. Those sorts of things, I would say, are more insights into, could that potentially be going on for me, and therefore is an adrenal stress panel useful?
Yeah, superb. And I know members of our nutrition team, Sana, Juliana, have already done some videos which really detail the signs and symptoms of adrenal stress and chronic stress. So if any of our listeners want to dig back into those for a little bit more context, then obviously they are there.
Yeah, great.
Anastasia and I will join you again to talk a little more about gastrointestinal testing. In the meantime, if you would like to hear more, obviously do look at us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and also obviously you can catch up with us online at www.theoptimumhealthclinic.com.